Hi.
Hello, Jennifer. This is Hannibal Anderson.
Hi, Hannibal. Uh-oh, Michelle, are you still there?
Yeah, it sounds like we're having some power outage issues at different places. So I know Michelle had her power out, so she was kind of cutting in and out. So maybe, Jen, do you want to get us started?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. Really appreciate your joining us today. As many of you know, we've had a number of these community conversations. And really the idea is for us all to learn, to kind of talk out some of these ideas and be able to just, frankly, have a conversation and opportunity to ask questions. So today we're going to county planning and talking about basic planning options in the county realm. And many of these options translate to an urban setting as well. But city and county planning can be a little different, and it's good to kind of make that distinction. And we've invited Mike Inman to join us. Mike, I believe, has a greater background now in county planning than I do. I was with the Gallatin County Planning Department for 10 years, but it's been a while. So at times I feel a little rusty. And then, but it's like all in there somewhere. For a while, I tried to ignore that it was in there. And because county planning, as Mike knows, can be a little stressful. So what we're going to do is, if I can get through these slides, is talk about these basic tools. What we have are growth policies, neighborhood plans, zoning, subdivision regulations, and building codes. And Mike and I are going to kind of go through each of these tools. And if you've been on our community conversations before, a lot of these are going to sound familiar. We've certainly talked about growth policies many times before, and Park County and Livingston, you guys, and Bozeman as well, have been working on growth policies in the recent years. So it's a little more familiar. But it's always good to kind of have a good understanding of what they are and what purpose they serve in terms of the other tools. And that will become apparent as we go into the slides here. So starting off with growth policies, I put up this old map, not only because I like old maps, but this one helps show that the idea of growth policies, which are also called comprehensive plans, go way back. And this happens to be Florida 1924. This is their comprehensive city plan map. I just wanted to kind of show you that growth policies and comp plans aren't like something that Mike Inman came up with in his office there at the city county building. This is a tool, a process, a plan that has been around for some time. Not only Florida, but across our country and across the world, quite frankly. So growth policies are non-regulatory. you can't have a policy, for instance, or a regulation within a growth policy that says something like houses have to be set back 15 feet from the street. That comes later into your regulatory documents, your subdivision regulations and your zoning. The growth policies are really meant to be kind of these comprehensive views on a location that help lay out future steps and the future game plan for the future. Future game plan for the future. That's good. And our growth policy concept comes right out of the Montana land use and planning statutes. This book I carry around all the time. And if you're a planning board member on the call today, this is a really good book to get your hands on. It's really helpful to kind of go through here and understand where all these rules come from. So you can ask Mike to get a copy for you. They're available at the Department of Commerce. One last point here on growth policies, and we'll get into this a little later, is that zoning and subdivision regulations have to be made in accordance with the growth policies. So there has to be overlap. There has to be a tie-in. You can't have a growth policy and then zoning that don't comport with one another. So I mentioned that growth policies and planning goes way back. And our first city planners really were the Romans, the Greeks, and the Etruscans before the Romans and the Greeks. And here's an outline of a city plan that dates back to like 400 BC. So it's been around for a while.
I have that on mute, obviously, but I don't know how to get rid of my picture. This is Jennifer Madgic talking.
Hi, Anne. We can hear you. I don't think you're on mute. Okay, neighborhood plans. So once again, neighborhood plans are mentioned in the planning statutes. And the idea of a neighborhood plan is it's kind of like a mini growth policy. The idea is, like in the case of Gardner, to hone in on a specific area and ensure that a smaller area can kind of get into some more details that the larger growth policy perhaps did not get into. So in the case of Gardner, Gardner is currently working on its own neighborhood plan. Their neighborhood plan would plug into the larger Park County growth policy, but you could see how important it is for a community like Gardner to perhaps have its own neighborhood plan, because there are elements in Gardner, you can see it from this Google Earth map, it's a more complicated area and it's deserving of kind of a finer level of detail. Once again, neighborhood plan is a non-regulatory tool, and it also comes out of the Montana land use and planning statutes, like I mentioned earlier. So zoning, Mike is going to take, if we still have Mike.
Yep, I'm here. So yeah, let's kind of get into zoning. That's pretty appropriate for the county, considering some of the work we're doing right now. Let me pull up. Actually, I'm not in control, but I'll just make sure I'm following the slide progression. So one of the things I'm gonna say right out of the gate, when it comes to county versus city, I think that counties are much more limited in the number and types of tools that they can use, as well as their administration and implementation of those tools. And I'll touch on that a little bit when we go through the different types of zoning that are available. Typically at the county level, you're going to hear discussions and talk of county zoning and citizen initiated zoning. Those are under the statutes, 76.3201 and 101. And some people refer to county initiated zoning as county imposed, and that's not necessarily correct. It's county initiated, and then there's zoning districts that are initiated by citizens. The previous slide showed that we have 6 different zoning districts in the county. Most of those are citizen initiated, with the exception of the US Highway 89 East River Road, Old Yellowstone Trail, which regulates signage from Livingston to Gardner. Zoning, like Jennifer said, does need to comply with a growth policy. And what that means is if a growth policy process is implemented and folks want to address certain issues throughout their jurisdiction, zoning may be a tool that can be used to actually meet those goals and objectives outlined in the growth policy. And we're seeing a discussion of that at the county level with the consideration of the conflict mitigation zoning district. So back to the difference between 201 and 101. County initiated zoning requires a very extensive public process, and it's designed to address issues that are fairly broad and cover a much broader jurisdictional area. For example, county initiated zoning can't be used to essentially zone out a specific development or a proposed development of sorts. It needs to be fairly widespread. And so when you look at county initiated zoning districts, they tend to encompass geographic areas that make sense or try to address an issue that's prevalent in that specific area. Citizen initiated zoning, the threshold for citizen initiated zoning is 40 acres. You have to have a minimum of 40 acres to create that district, and you have to have 60% of the landowners within that district. They have to sign a petition to create it. So it can be much smaller, and it can be very specific to an area and a very small number of landowners. Whereas county initiated tends to be broader and cover issues that are more widespread. That's typical. One of the issues with how the county addresses land use issues versus how the city addresses things, one has to do with our funding model. If the county adopts any kind of regulatory process, we can't increase taxes or come up with any additional funds to cover the cost of administrating those tools. We can develop fees specific to what it takes to actually review and process and administer those fees or those permits. But that may or may not cover the additional staff that's necessary to try to implement a zoning district. And that can make things really complicated for a county. If you're implementing tools that require additional resources and additional enforcement, and you have no additional funds to do that, that can be a strain on the county and its resources. When it comes to zoning itself, there are different types of zoning, and we're having this discussion at the county level. If you look at the city of Livingston, that is a single use zoning district, also referred to as a Euclidean zoning district, and it is designed to identify what land use types should be implemented by geographic area. And so you'll see, like in the city of Livingston, you have areas that are zoned R1, R2, R3. Those are different density residential zones. You have commercial zones, you have industrial zones, manufacturing, those types of things. Those were implemented pretty widespread across the United States. And if you look at most communities that have zoning, you're going to see a lot of that Euclidean style zoning where you've identified what areas should house what land use types. There's also mixed use zoning, which is becoming more popular over time. And that allows for different mixes of uses in the same zone or same geographic area. And they're becoming more popular when you start to think about transportation and how do you get people in residential zones to areas where they would shop and buy groceries and things like that. And if you segregate everything out, then you're requiring people to transport further, and it makes that system more complicated. So mixed use zones are becoming more widely accepted, and that allows for a variety of uses within one geographic area. Then there's performance-based zoning and conditional zoning, and those are designed to address land use types based on how they perform in that given area. And usually requires more analysis, but the idea is that the land use type in and of itself isn't necessarily prohibited, but the jurisdiction recognizes that there may be problems associated with that land use. So they create a process to analyze that particular proposal and make sure that it doesn't impact or cause problems based on the purpose behind said zoning district. Trying to think, interim emergency zoning, you'll see this brought up at times. Interim, or what it's referred to as generally as emergency zoning. This is, again, the jurisdiction that looks at adopting interim zoning first must identify an emergency. The only time since I've been here that that's been considered and actually approved by the county commission to initiate that was when 2011 district court decision nullified what used to be the city county zoning jurisdiction. The commissioners at that time received a lot of public feedback, and basically they determined the emergency was folks that had been in a zoning district for, at that time, 37 years lost that protection. And so without the zoning, all the residential areas could now be commercial or any other type of land use. And so they saw that as an emergency, and they moved forward with the potential of creating that interim zoning. It failed at the end of the day, but the idea is that you can create a zoning district for a period of 1 year with the potential to renew it for an additional year. You're required to go through the process of 201 zoning to create an actual zoning district. So emergency zoning is not an end all, it's a temporary placeholder. It can be done fairly quickly, and it usually is to try to address whatever emergency has been identified and then create zoning through a very public process to manage that emergency or the impacts for a longer period of time. And you can see some of the examples that you'll see used in Montana that are on the slide there. Where emergency zoning gets a county or a jurisdiction in trouble is if it's used to target a single development.
And I would add on to the discussion of zoning, just to say that zoning is tricky. Over my time as a planner, I've seen examples of zoning that has really worked well for a particular area. It's like people have gotten together and done a really good job of kind of crafting a regulation that fits a particular area. And I've seen examples of just the opposite of zoning that does not work well for a particular area. So that is something I think that is a good takeaway about zoning. It doesn't mean one thing. It can be extremely varied, as it should be, that it can do both good things and potentially bad things. Over the course of zoning's life here in our country, it has segregated people. You know, it's put Black people over here and white people over here. It's put poor people on this side of the tracks and rich people on this side of the tracks. So it's done, and it's also done great things like protecting, wild lambs and you can use zoning in a very good way to help protect a wild area or a river corridor or protect a community, you know, in terms of here's the urban area and here's the rural area. So that's kind of just my takeaway, Mike. You know, got good zoning and bad zoning, and the key to getting good zoning is having neighbors come together, having a community come together and work on those details to get it right. And that's not easy.
Yeah, I would agree. You know, zoning can be a really valuable tool, but it can also be one that if you're using zoning inappropriately, you'll end up creating more problems than you'll solve within the district. And a lot of thought has to go into it. It does have to follow statutory requirements for what's included, the process used to create it, and then how it's administered and enforced. Enforcement we've seen in Park County has been an ongoing issue because to enforce requires you know, staffing to keep track of what's going on in the district. It requires coordination with the attorney's office and the justice court system. And we've seen in the past that there has not been an appetite at the attorney level to prosecute misdemeanors when it comes to land use violations, and even at the level of the district court. So it requires a lot of unity within those three different jurisdictions to work together, and that requires resources.
Absolutely correct. And resources when it comes to any planning department is a really important, critical component. You know, if you don't have the staffing, if you don't have the enforcement, so many of these well-laid plans can kind of fall by the wayside. So I'm going to talk a little bit about subdivision regulations. Once again, subdivision regulations need to tie into your growth policy. They are a regulatory tool and a tool that, once again, comes out of our subdivision and platting book. If you can see my book here, all of this stuff in my left hand is subdivision stuff out of state law. And so the Montana Subdivision and Platting Act is extremely detailed on all of these rules that local jurisdictions have to follow when it comes to subdivision regulations. And it's, once again, the regulatory tool, the important regulatory teeth of a growth policy or planning in a jurisdiction. This Montana Planning and Land Use and Planning statute lays out the purpose of regulating subdivisions. And the purpose are all of these items that should sound familiar. Promotion of public health, welfare, and safety, preventing the overcrowding of land, lessening congestion in streets, requiring development in harmony with nature. It allows the preservation of open space, promotion of cluster development, helps protect the rights of property owners. And lastly, it requires uniform monumentation. So all plats, like the plat that you're seeing on the left, has a lot of the same components. That's a requirement. So there's a definition in Montana of a subdivision. And the definition is the creation of a lot less than 160 acres. So if anyone in Montana wants to create a lot that's under 160 acres, you have to go through subdivision review unless you have an exemption. And we can talk about exemptions here in a second. But in Montana, it used to be, and it was before my time here in Montana, that you could create a lot 20 acres or less without going through subdivision review. And we are still seeing all across Montana kind of the consequences of that law on the landscape. And Mike, I think you can talk about the number of 20-acre or less lots that you have in Park County that never went through subdivision review. I don't know if you have any idea how many are out there.
And so up until 1993, I think is when that changed.
Yep.
You could divide into 20, I think it was 20 or larger acre parcels without going through review. If it was less, you had to go through review. Sanitation, so under the Sanitation Subdivision Act, it's still 20 acres. So if you are dividing over 20 acres, you don't have to go through sanitation review. If you're dividing anything that creates parcels less than 20 acres, you do. There are a lot in Park County, and most of those derive from just before the law changed. So the impact of changing it from 20 acres to 160s, it created a rush of divisions at that time through certificate of survey. The entirety of Glastonbury, the Wine Glass, Caledonia, you can just go down through the county and there are hundreds, if not thousands of 20-acre parcels that were created at that time because they didn't require any review. And so the inadverse impact of that legislative change resulted in, thousands upon thousands of parcels being created without any review, any consideration for access, or and those parcels were created through a certificate of survey, and to this day you see a lot of them out there that haven't been built upon. So the impacts of that development and the land use type remains to be seen in a lot of those areas.
Correct. Exemptions, there are a number of exemptions from subdivision review. One that is used widely throughout Montana is the family transfer. Basically, Montana law allows you to create lots as for family members. And I know you have a number of those in Park County as well, Mike.
Yep.
And an exemption basically means that you can create a lot without going through subdivision reviews. So it's very similar to that 20-acre rule, 20-acre or greater rule prior to 1993. It's exempt from the strict standards and criteria in the subdivision regulations. So that's the reason Montana has so many 20-acre lots. And there's the date that law changed from 20 acres to 160 acres. And I pulled out a plat here. This is actually a subdivision in Gallatin County off the Bear Canyon exit. And if you see all of these pink lines, these are 20-acre tracts that were created back before 1993. You can see they're all awkward lots that connect to the road that goes through the middle there, Star Ridge Road. This development never went through review. Basically, the developer just hired a surveyor, created a plat and filed it with the clerk and recorder's office. So bypassed the planning department. And in this particular case, the lots are obviously very weird shape to accommodate that road and to accommodate some topography in the area. But it's considered to be a relatively nice rural place to live in Gallatin County. But the Gallatin County has the same issue. Many lots created here that never went through subdivision review. So the primary criteria for subdivision review, the governing body, Park County Commissioners, the County Planning Board needs to review subdivisions based on this primary criteria. And agriculture is top of the list. Agriculture, you've got to consider agriculture, water user facilities, ditches, and so forth. You have to consider local services. You have to consider the natural environment, wildlife habitat, public health and safety. And in Gallatin County, when I worked there, I was there from 1997 to 2007, which was a really high growth time before the recession hit in 2006, 2007. I worked on quite a few subdivisions, and it was during a time that we actually used both the primary criteria and the Gallatin County growth policy as kind of opportunities to deny subdivisions, deny inappropriate subdivisions. So for instance, we had it was a 234 lot mobile home park on the Gallatin River in a very rural part of Gallatin County. County commissioners thought it was an inappropriate area for that kind of development. It didn't comply or comport with our growth policy. There were conflicts, but it also had impacts on some of those primary criteria. So Gallatin County became quite proficient at denying subdivisions that were considered inappropriate and inconsistent both with the growth policy and with aspects of the primary criteria and so forth out of the Montana Subdivision Platting Act. We were sued a number of times, and in every single case, we won the lawsuit. So I just want to bring this up that there are other ways to help direct growth. And Mike, I don't know if you want to kind of add on to that or talk about it a little bit, but I just want to kind of make sure that folks recognize that without zoning, there are also other opportunities to kind of regulate out inappropriate development if a governing body is willing to go there. And if you've got growth policy that kind of talks about inappropriate subdivision.
Yeah, I think that one of the, sorry, getting a phone call. One of the issues that I see, two things with subdivisions. It's a great tool when you have a subdivision that comes in. You're really able to analyze it. You can provide a host of recommendations through the form of conditions to ensure that it doesn't impact the criteria that you see on your screen. But one of the downsides to subdivision is your analysis can't go beyond the borders of the subdivision itself, unless you're looking at access. And so what we have seen in Park County, it's kind of death by a thousand cuts. We get a lot of minor subdivisions. We have over the past 40 years. And every 4 or 5 lot minor subdivision, that's all you're looking at. And so when it comes to impacts to wildlife habitat, open space, corridors, the natural environment, amenities, it's all within the boundaries. And Glastonbury is a perfect example where you had 20-acre parcels, hundreds of them created through a division of land that didn't go through review. They allowed for tenants in common on every one of those 20-acre parcels. They were sued by the county in the mid-90s, and the settlement indicated that they would go through subdivision review. And so every time we do a subdivision, it's of a 20-acre parcel, and they usually create 4 or 5 acre lots because that's what their homeowners association requires. And we only look at the impacts of that 1 4 lot. So when you're thinking about the impacts to all of these criteria and you think, okay, what is the impact to agriculture with 4 additional residential lots. Well, it's going to be pretty minimal. So is the impact to local services. You know, 1 more trip out, 2 more trips out. So you go down through the list and you think not that big a deal. Well, fast forward 30, 40 years, and if 400 parcels all get divided into 5-acre, you know, parcels, and now you've got 2,000 lots. If you were to review that in one time, 2,000 would be a substantial impact to most of the criteria we're looking at. But if it's all minor subdivision, we don't have the ability to look beyond, or the authority to look at those impacts beyond the actual subdivision boundary. And I think that's one of the areas where state law really lets us down. And I think that that's where zoning and some of these other things come into play. And Jennifer's right. If you don't have zoning, there are other things that may regulate a certain land use type, but they don't all address the same issues. And, you know, it really gets discouraging when you have development that comes in and they don't have to consider the structure of their building. They don't have to consider access. They don't have to consider the impacts to wildfire. Maybe they have to get a septic permit. So you'll see this hodgepodge of what applies and what doesn't apply depending upon the proposal. And it just creates an environment like Park County where certain things are regulated fairly well and a lot of things aren't regulated at all. And so, you know, land use is all dependent upon the individual moving forward with the project.
Really good points. And that really kind of drives home the importance of the big picture comprehensive planning. You know, in an ideal world, I think we'd want to take a county like Park County through a growth policy process followed by a zoning process that is looking at the entirety of the county as opposed to piecemeal. And both subdivision regulations and the citizen zoning districts, the smaller zoning districts, really look at things in a piecemeal fashion, not in an overall kind of broad scope, looking at comprehensively, how does this impact the good of the whole? So there's a lot of imperfection. And I think if Mike and I, as planners, could go into a room and kind of, you know, plan, it would make things a lot easier. And we're tripped up often by the planning statutes and the will of the people or the will of your local officials.
I think that's a good point. I see a question, how can we change the subdivision review process to look holistically at cumulative impacts? That's a legislative change. All that we do when it comes to regulatory oversight of anything requires the legislature to provide that authority and set forth what we can look at. And you can really see the rub between the legislative and the local, especially when you throw politics into it, because you know, what we see is, yep, we're not going to allow different funding models. We're not going to allow more expansive zoning or consideration outside of subdivision reviews. We're going to let the local authority do that. And we're going to hamstring them by the laws that we set forth. And I'm sure Jennifer would agree, when you're trying to administer state law when it comes to land use, it's really discouraging at times because the laws themselves don't really set you up to succeed, especially when it comes to trying to deal with certain issues.
And speaking of the legislature, there is some fear that we're going to go backwards here with this legislature in terms of planning statutes. So a lot of planners and jurisdictions are waiting to see potential changes. So we have 20 minutes. And I want to leave time for questions. So I'm going to go through some of these next slides kind of quickly. But here's just an example of, you know, some creativity that you have options for. There are things called planned unit developments, clustered developments, and you can see the difference between the development on the right from the left. The left is large lots, sprawl, you've cut into the forest. The design on the right is clustered and protects the forest. So just different options for creativity. Zoning doesn't all have to be cookie cutter. Lots don't all have to be cookie cutter. You can do things like require building envelopes. So the diagram on the right has homes that have to be developed within these building envelopes, and that could be really helpful in terms of the urban wildland interface and other applications. Here's just another example of a clustered development, homes all clustered together and open space preserved. It helps in a variety of aspects, not just preserve the open space and wildlife habitat, but you're putting potentially less road surface, less impervious surface, less resources. You can bring the cost down of development with a clustered development if it's done right. So Mike, you're going to talk a little bit about building codes and wildland urban interface.
Yep. One question I see on the board is, why is access not considered a primary criteria? And it is. Every subdivision has to have physical and legal access in addition. And that's a big one. That's what trips up most people that come into my office, is physical and legal access. So one of the other tools Jennifer mentioned is building codes. And building codes are pretty uniform in most of our incorporated communities, at least any of them with a larger population. So City of Bozeman, City of Livingston, all have building codes, and that regulates how a structure is built. They can include setbacks, construction standards. Most communities in Montana will adopt the national uniform building codes and apply them. Building codes don't necessarily address issues associated with land use types. That's what the zoning is for. And then building codes address the structure. And then when it comes to like county, what we've started to see is building codes in the form of fire protection and prevention, often referred to as wildland urban interface WUI codes. And those are, those are implemented to ensure that when a wildfire comes through, that the construction of buildings is done in a way that mitigates the impacts of that wildfire and mitigates the impacts of a structure fire to result in a wildfire. That's something that we're working on with Headwaters Economics and this community planning assistance for wildfire. And I can tell you that that's going to lead to a discussion of why don't we require homes to be built in such a way that they won't start on fire if a wildfire comes through. But it's an ongoing effort. One of the difficulties with building codes in an urban or a rural center or a rural jurisdiction versus an urban center. So Jim Woodhull, city planning director for Livingston, they adopt and require building codes. And when I worked in Belgrade, I was the assistant building inspector. And the way that worked was every phase of construction, we reviewed every development, and people would submit their building permits and they would keep us informed of their progress, because we inspected the foundation, we inspected the framing, we inspected the plumbing, the electrical, all the way through construction. And we would go and review anywhere from 10 to 20, 30 homes on every Friday of the week. And it was completely doable. Our fees covered the cost of that administration. But then you apply it to a county standard, and you can imagine what it would look like if we had building codes and I was required to drive to Cook City and Silvergate to inspect every phase of construction for 15 homes in that area. It would completely hamstring our ability, given the fact that it's a 7-hour drive there and back. So when you spread out the same number of structures and development over a jurisdiction like Park County, the administration of those codes becomes really difficult. But those are tools that are available to us, and they can address a host of things, but only related to the structures themselves and not the land use type.
In Gallatin County, we had land use permits that were required in our zoning districts. And it was basically to ensure, we didn't care about building code per se. It was more the external house and where in some cases it was situated on a lot. We tried to keep homes in some of the districts, like Bridger Canyon zoning district, I think is a really good example. They try to keep homes off ridge lines. And so land use permits can be kind of a good way to help, make sure your structures are being put in appropriate places without caring per se about the code of the buildings. And it was a way for the department to generate some revenue to help pay for the cost of the zoning districts. And in Big Sky in particular, that became really important. Big Sky is 40 miles outside of Bozeman where the planning offices are. And it took a considerable amount of manpower to oversee that pretty complicated zoning district. So to have that revenue was helpful. Okay, so I think we have about 10 minutes for questions. I'm curious if we have Michelle back.
Hi, Jen. Can you see me?
Good. Glad you're back. I didn't give a tremendous amount of overview at the beginning. I don't know if you want to chime in, just say something.
Yeah, I'll be really quick because I want to make sure we have time for questions. So thank you. And I apologize. The storm ramped up right as we were kicking this off and half of town lost power. And I made it into the office for the first time in a long time. So welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. My name's Michelle Ibraga, and I'm the Executive Director for Park County Environmental Council. So we're your community conservation group, and we work here in Park County to safeguard the land, water, wildlife, and communities in Yellowstone, Northern Gateway through advocacy and grassroots organizing. So I just want to give a context for why we're hosting this presentation, and thank Jen and Mike. I was able to jump on and listen, and it was a really robust topic. There is a lot happening right now in our community, and we've been seeing more and more people retreating to gateway communities like ours to live near natural amenities, public lands, the Yellowstone River, and Yellowstone National Park. And this trend's been happening for years, but with the pandemic, the increase in new residents here in Southwest Montana is quite remarkable. And as we know, growth at that rate can lead to problems traditionally thought of as big city problems, like lack of affordable housing, availability of public transit, congestion, and income inequality. And so now more than ever, it's really important that we work together at the local level to make sure we avoid those challenges, set out a vision for how we want to grow in a way that maintains our unique character, doesn't overly burden taxpayers, and protects our way of life. So in our community is in the midst of a couple of important planning efforts at the city and at the county. I want to thank everybody that's been participating in these presentations. Our goal here is to create a space where we can learn about the tools that we can use to address these problems, to protect the river, our wildlands, and our values, and then show up to the meetings where decisions are being made with a shared language and understanding to ask for what we need, the change we need to see. And folks have been participating, and thanks to that, the city is updating their growth policy, and the city planning board just set out a really ambitious schedule to go through our growth policy section by section with public input. So thank you all for participating, and that's really exciting to see. And then we kicked off with this conversation around planning tools. It's a bit of we were laughing, it's a bit of a dry topic, but wanted to kick off 2021, recognizing that the Park County Planning Board has been tasked by the commission, because they've heard loud and clear from community members that we want more proactive planning. And that's goal 16 in the growth policy sets that out. We've got new planning board members. And so we thought just talking about tools would be a good way to find some common ground and get on the same page for 2021. So thank you all for joining us. These are recorded. You can check them out on our website. We'll also share them via email. So we've got a schedule up on our website and links to previous conversations on the Take Action page there. So if you heard about this meeting from a friend or through Facebook, you can go onto our website at pcecmt.org and join our mailing list, and you'll get emails about future conversations. We also are working really hard to line these conversations up with relevant topics to decision-making that's happening. If you have ideas for topics you'd like to hear more about, please shoot us an email. Let's open it up to questions. Thank you so much, Jen and Mike, for the detailed presentation.
Super exciting, I know.
I'm gonna take out screen share.
Not all at once, please.
So I see you guys have been addressing questions. Mike, I heard you kind of seeing them as they pop up in the chat. Because I haven't been, the questions in the chat, have we addressed all of those?
I asked, this is Lily DeFord. I'm with the Gallatin Watershed Council over in Bozeman. Thank you so much for putting this on. This is really great information, and that's a topic that I find daunting and feel like I'm always behind the ball. Like something's already happened, and I'm like, oh, scrambling to try to catch up. So thank you so much. I asked the first question, and Jennifer, you mentioned that zoning can help protect river corridors, and that's especially of interest in the Gallatin and also over in Park County, I would imagine, and was hoping you could expand on that.
Sure. I think one of my example slides that I used of the clustered homes versus the sprawled homes was a good example, where zoning could say you can only create lots of a certain size, and it can stipulate kind of protection of certain areas, or it could set up the need to have a building envelope that is, certain feet from wetlands or off a ridge line or out of the urban wildfire zone, outside of the forest. So zoning can be, add a number of setbacks, design standards, and direct homes to a certain area. And you can be really creative on how you use zoning to protect resources that you want to protect. And I think there's many examples, particularly in Gallatin County. A number of communities have river setbacks. You have a river corridor, and you can't build 100 feet from the high water mark of the river. Mike, I don't know if you want to add anything.
No, I think, once you if you identify the problem and you've identified the tool, then you just have to build in the types of analysis or provisions that would mitigate whatever impacts you're looking at. So for our subdivision regulations, we don't allow any portion of a subdivision to be within 150 feet of the Yellowstone or Shields or West Boulder River, or outside the regulated flood hazard area. So that's just one tool that kind of helps that. But if it's an unmapped stream, then that setback no longer applies For example, along Trail Creek, people can literally develop right up to the water's edge if they don't disturb the actual stream bed. So yeah, it's something that can be implemented. It just has to be kind of well thought out and included in one of those tools.
And then, that's a great question. I thank you so much for joining us, Lily. I want to just share that our next community conversation, we rescheduled. It was on the 20th, and because of the inauguration and other events on that day, we moved it to January 27th. We'll be joined by Jeff Reed, Whitney Tilt, and Max Yortzberg to talk about the work that they've done on recreation impacts on the Yellowstone River. So that's January 27th at noon is our next conversation, and I'll put it in the chat. But that may be of interest to you and to many folks in our community concerned about impacts to the Yellowstone River. We've got 3 minutes here. How about, Mike, do you want to share when the next county planning board meeting is and how people can participate? And then after that, I'm happy to share about the next city planning board meeting and how people can participate.
Sure. So our board will be meeting on the 20, let me make sure I get this right. On the 21st, so next Thursday at 4 o'clock. And we'll have the agenda out probably tomorrow or Thursday. And so you can just go to parkcounty.org and click on the agendas just like you would for the commissioners on the homepage. And you'll see the agendas and you'll see the agenda for the planning board. And that will include the login information we'll be using, the GoToMeeting that the commissioners use with just a slightly different passcode. And will be it's the beginning of the year, so we'll be talking about election of officers and kind of when and where the board will meet in the upcoming year, at least what they're anticipating. And then conflict mitigation, zoning district and regulations is the main topic of discussion.
Great.
And Michelle, I see Matthew from the city.
Oh, great.
And if we're not putting him on the spot too much, maybe you can give us a quick city update.
Yeah, sure. City Planning Board is continuing growth policy conversations. They decided at the last meeting that they were going to meet basically every 2 weeks until April to hopefully get that done. Those meetings will basically be in parallel with City Commission meetings. So if there's a City Commission meeting on a Tuesday, there'll be a Planning Board meeting on a Wednesday. The next meeting is the 20th. And the public is always welcome to come and participate at those. Specifically, the topics of discussion at the next meeting are growth policy maps and the extraterritorial jurisdiction, which is Appendix A of the growth policy.
Thank you, Matthew. And we have the goal of chatting with you and Jesse to learn about how we can give effective comment, because I know you guys have a ton of content to get through together. So I want to make sure that the public is participating, adding value, and helping you guys move that through that process. So we'll chat more about that and before that meeting on the 20th. Thank you for all your hard work. We're really excited about that process. Well, with that, it's 1 o'clock. I really like ending meetings on time. I'm sorry about the getting off the ground, and maybe I was the only one that experienced trouble, but grateful for everybody for participating. This is recorded and will be on our website at pccmt.org. So we look forward to seeing you at future conversations, in meetings, and don't hesitate to give a call or shoot an email if you have any questions and want to chat one-on-one with Jen or myself about this work. Take care. Have a good day.